Hello everyone. In this tutorial, we're going to containerize a full stack to-do application using Docker. The app uses Express on the backend and Next.js on the front end. So to get started with the containerization, we are going to firstly specify the image in a Docker file. We are using Node.js version 24 with Alpine variant because it is lightweight and it includes the current Node LTS runtime as the base. Next, we'll set up the working directory inside the container to app. After that, we will copy the package.json and package log files. Then we'll install dependencies using npm install. Once the dependencies are installed, we copy the rest of the backend source code into the container. Since the backend is written in TypeScript, we run the build command to compile it into JavaScript. Next, we expose port 500 so the container can accept incoming requests. Finally, we define the startup command, which runs the compiled server using Node. At this point, the backend container is ready. Okay, now we move on to creating a Docker ignore for the backend. So this works just like git ignore. Before building our containers, we need to add it as it prevents sending unnecessary files to the Docker build context. Common entries we use for this includes node modules, so npm debug log, dist, and essentially whatever that's going to be generated with your app that you don't need to send to the Docker build contexts, just to make sure the build is faster and the final image is smaller. Next, we containerize the front end. Inside the front end directory, we create a Docker file. Just like before, we start with Node 24 with the Alpine variant. Node 24 is the current LTS version of Node.js. And Alpine is a lightweight Linux distribution which helps keep our Docker images small. Next, we set the working directory inside the container to app. This is where our application code will live. After that, we copy the package.json and package.json files into the container. So this step is important because Docker catches layers. If our dependencies don't change, Docker won't reinstall them on every build, which speeds things up. Next, we install the project dependencies using npm install. Once the dependencies are installed, we copy the rest of the application code into the container. Since this is a Next.js application, we run npm run build to generate the production build. Then we expose port 3000, which is the default port used by Next.js. Finally, we define the command that starts the application. In this case, we run npm start, which launches the production server. At this point, our frontend container is ready to run. Next, we create a Docker ignore file for the frontend. This pretty much serves the same purpose as the one on the backend of the application. The purpose is similar to .git ignore. It tells Docker which files and directories should not be included in building the image. It helps to keep the build context smaller and avoid sending unnecessary files to the Docker daemon. So now that both the front end and the back end have Docker files, we can use Docker Compose to run them together. In the root of the project, we create a file called dockercompose.yaml. Docker Compose allows us to define and manage multiple containers as part of a single application. Inside this file, we create a services section. Each service represents a container that will run as part of our application. The first service is called backend. Here we specify the build context as the backend directory. This tells Docker Compose to build the backend image using the Docker file located inside that folder. Next, we define the ports section. We map port 5000 on the host machine to port 5000 inside the container. This allows us to access the backend API from our local environment. Next, we define the front-end service. Just like the backend, we will specify the build context as the front-end directory so Docker Compose knows where to find the Docker file. So that's going to be front-end directory. Then we also map port 3000 on the host machine to port 3000 inside the container. This is where Next.js application will be accessible in the browser. Finally, we add the depends on property. This tells Docker Compose that the front-end service depends on the back-end service. When we start the application, Docker Compose will start the backend container before starting the front-end container. With this configuration in place, both services can be built and run together using a single Docker Compose command. So now that everything is configured, we can start the application using Docker Compose. Then we run Docker Compose up build. This tells Docker Compose to build the images and starts the containers defined in dockercompose.yaml. So the build flag that we added, it forces Docker to build the images before starting the container. So it will go into the backend directory to read the backend Docker file, build the backend image. Then it will also go into the frontend directory, read the frontend Docker file, and build the frontend image. Docker then creates a network. So Docker Compose automatically creates a network for the project, allowing containers to communicate with each other. So now head on to Docker Desktop and check on your container. What details should be there like this. Then we can go on to the application It should be running correctly, provided you've done everything right, and we can try create operations. So we can try addition, creation. Yeah, so we can create multiple list items in our to-do list. And we can also update, so we can mark them as red, which is updating. We can read, and we can delete. So everything seems to be working well. If you followed all the steps correctly, everything should be working well. And we can, now that we've verified everything is working well, when we want to close the application, we can run Docker compose down to kill our containers. And we want to run the application, we want to start the application at another time. It's as simple as running Docker compose up. There's no need for the build to be added again, and everything should work well.